The twin suns of Zero-9 bathed the Imperial Dragon Palace in golden light, casting long shadows across its endless glass corridors and crystal towers that sparkled like frozen lightning. Inside, silent and unnoticed, a human girl named Alira moved quietly through the halls, clutching a tray as if it were a shield. She had only been a maid in the palace for 2 weeks, but already she had learned how to avoid the sharp gazes of the older staff, how to blend in like a shadow, and how to say yes, sir, and no, madam, without hesitation. The dragons, tall and proud with their gleaming scales and deep, rumbling voices, rarely looked at her except to give orders except one. Emperor Vurix. He was not like the others. Cold and distant. Yes, but there was something in his golden eyes that saw more than most. Alira never dared to speak to him beyond what was required, but today, as she bent to set a cup of steaming elixir on his throne-side table, his eyes narrowed. She flinched slightly when she extended her arm, the sleeves pulling back just enough to reveal the edge of a dark bruise. It was small, barely visible, but Vurix's gaze locked onto it like a targeting system. He said nothing at first, only stared in silence as Alira quickly adjusted her sleeve and bowed away. She had hoped that would be the end of it. But later that evening, as the stars glowed outside the throne chamber and silence wrapped around the palace, a soft chime rang through her small servant quarters. "You are summoned," said the cold voice of the palace AI. Her heart skipped. Summoned? By who? She was escorted by 2 silent guards through quiet halls, and the farther they walked, the more her fear grew. Had she made a mistake? Spilled something? Looked the wrong way? The guards stopped at the massive bronze doors to the Emperor's private study and stepped aside. Alira entered slowly. The room was dimly lit, filled with ancient books and swirling holograms of long-forgotten star systems. Vurix stood at the far end, back turned, wings folded. When he spoke, it was with calm authority. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a small chair. She obeyed without a word. "What happened to your arm?" The question was like ice in her veins. Her lips moved before her mind could think. "I fell," she whispered, looking down. It was nothing. Silence, long and deep. Then Vurix turned. His eyes met hers, not with anger, but with something else, concern, maybe, or something older. "Do not lie to me, Alira," he said. Softly, she froze. She wanted to explain, to make excuses, but she couldn't. The truth was painful. Some of the other staff non-humans from other allied worlds didn't like her presence. Some saw humans as weak, primitive, unworthy of serving in such a grand place. There had been shoves, harsh words, even slaps when no one was watching. She had kept it to herself, thinking it would pass. But now the Emperor knew. "Still," she said, "nothing." Vurix stared at her for a moment longer, then turned to the room's central console and spoke a single word: "Review." A shimmering projection appeared, displaying footage from various corners of the palace hallways, storerooms, servant quarters. And in those clips, the truth unraveled: a push near the kitchens, a slap when she dropped a cloth, a cruel whisper behind her back. Her face turned red with shame, but Vurix said nothing. He watched all of it in silence. When it ended, he deactivated the console. "Go to your quarters," he said at last. "Rest." She stood quickly, confused, relieved, and still trembling. As she reached the door, he spoke once more, voice like thunder wrapped in calm. "They will not touch you again." She looked back, but he had already turned away. The guards led her out, and she returned to her room, heart racing with questions. What did he mean? What would happen next? Somewhere deep in the palace, a silent command traveled through encrypted channels to the barracks of the Imperial Guard. 10 elite warriors, bound by oath to serve the Emperor without question, received a simple directive: locate and detain the staff members listed in the attached files. No delay, no noise, no mercy. As Alira lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to calm her breathing, the palace began to shift. Quiet footsteps echoed in distant corridors, doors opened and closed. And in the Emperor's study, Vurek stood alone, staring out into the stars, the memory of an ancient war returning to his mind, a war where humans had once stood beside dragons as equals, as allies, as friends. His claws curled slightly, not in anger, but in purpose. He had seen a bruise. But what he really saw was the wound inside an empire that had forgotten what honor truly meant. And tomorrow, the halls of power would tremble, not with fire, but with justice. The palace was quiet the next morning, but it was not the calm of peace, it was the silence of something heavy hanging in the air, something unspoken, but felt by everyone. Alira woke early, still shaken by her meeting with the Emperor the night before. Her body ached, not just from the bruises, but from the weight of fear and confusion. She didn't know what would happen now. No one had spoken to her, and the other servants had begun to avoid her completely, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. She dressed quickly and tried to go about her duties, but a message came from the palace before she could even leave her quarters. Report to the Emperor's chamber at once. Her hands went cold. She walked the shining halls slowly, heart pounding, wondering what he would say, what he had done. When she entered the vast chamber, Emperor Vurek was seated on a tall throne of polished obsidian, sunlight from the twin stars catching the gold in his eyes. He didn't speak at first. He studied her, as if trying to read something behind her face. "Come closer," he said. His voice was deep and calm, but there was something beneath it, like distant thunder. Before a storm, she stepped forward and stood still. "I asked you a question last night," he said. "You did not answer truthfully." Alira lowered her head, ashamed. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she whispered. "I thought it would stop if I stayed quiet." Vurek leaned forward, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Tell me the truth now," he said. "All of it." She hesitated, then slowly spoke about the cruel words, the shoves, the tasks made harder on purpose, the slaps when no one looked, and the fear that had followed her every day since she arrived. She didn't cry, though she wanted to. She just looked tired. When she finished, there was silence. Then Vurek stood. He towered over her, scales catching the light, wings folded behind him like a curtain of armor. "You did not deserve any of it," he said simply. Then he raised a claw and spoke to the air. "Display summary." A list appeared midair, glowing. Softly, a report of the 10 individuals involved, species, positions, and footage time stamps. Alira's breath caught. He had already known it all before she even spoke. "Why did you ask me?" Then, she asked in a small voice. The Emperor looked down at her, and for a moment, his voice was gentler than she expected, because truth is not just in evidence, it is in the courage to speak. He turned and walked toward the wide balcony overlooking the court towers of the palace. "This empire was built on strength," he said, "but also on honor. Somewhere along the way, some forgot what that means." Then he looked to the sky. "That ends today." As he spoke, the heavy doors opened again. Alira turned, startled, as the Imperial Guard entered, tall, armored figures with polished weapons and blank expressions. "You will accompany them," Vurek told her. "You will stand with me when judgment is passed." Alira froze. "Me?" she asked, almost in disbelief. "Why?" He looked at her as if it were obvious. "Because you are the reason we will. Remember what justice means." Before she could say more, the guard stepped forward and gently led her out. The palace halls felt different now, like they were watching. As she walked beside the guards, nobles and staff turned their heads. Some gasped, others frowned, but none dared to speak. Word spread fast. The Emperor had summoned justice. The accused staff members, unaware of what awaited them, were already being brought to the hall of confrontation. They were confused, nervous, whispering among themselves, until the doors opened and they saw Alira walk in beside the Emperor himself. Then their faces changed: shock, fear, disbelief. Vurek rose from his seat at the center of the great hall. surrounded by nobles, advisors, and commanders. These recordings, he said, activating the display, were taken over the past weeks. What followed was silence broken only by the sound of the clips of Lyra being shoved, insulted, struck, humiliated. No one could look away. When it ended, Vorex's voice filled the hall. This is not the way of the Empire. We do not raise our hands against the innocent. We do not dishonor those who serve with dignity. The accused tried to speak, but Vorex silenced them with a single motion. You will be stripped of rank and title. You will be exiled to the outer labor colonies, where you will serve under watch until your debt is paid not to her, but to the ideals you betrayed. The guards moved quickly. There was no protest, only fear. Lyra stood still, overwhelmed by the sight of it all. She had come from nothing, just a servant girl from a small Earth colony, and now she was standing beside the most powerful being in the Empire. Vorex looked at her one last time before the crowd. You are not invisible, Lyra, he said. Not anymore. And in that moment, every noble and general in the room realized that something had changed not just in the Emperor's heart, but in the very core of the Empire itself. That night, the palace of 09 was brighter than ever, yet the air was thick with silence as the Empire prepared for an event not seen in centuries, judgment beneath the stars, an ancient rite once used only for traitors and war criminals, now summoned by the Emperor himself for a crime of dishonor committed not by generals, but by servants. Lyra stood quietly behind the black stone pillars at the edge of the ceremonial platform, unsure of how to breathe, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the twin moons above. She had thought the punishments had already been dealt, that exile and disgrace would be the end, but Vorex had announced one more step: public judgment, not for revenge, but to show the entire Empire what justice meant when even the smallest voice was heard. Nobles from all across the galaxy had been summoned to witness the trial under the open sky, where no walls or shadows could hide cruelty. The 10 offenders were brought out, their hands bound in light cuffs, their faces drained of color. They were no longer powerful, no longer proud. Lyra's heart pounded as she watched them kneel in silence before the crowd, but her fear was mixed with something else: strength. For the first time, she stood not as a servant, but as someone whose pain had been seen, whose voice had reached beyond marble halls and golden thrones. Emperor Vorex stepped forward, dressed in ancient ceremonial armor, wings stretched high, and his voice rolled across the night like a storm. We gather not for punishment alone, he said, but for remembrance. Injustice, when hidden, grows. But when seen beneath the stars, it cannot survive. The crowd stood silent. Stars blinked above, eternal watchers of truth. Then he turned to the accused. You are given one final chance, he said. Not to escape your fate, but to speak before those you have wronged, not only the girl you struck, but the honor of this empire itself. One by one, the offenders were asked to speak. Some remained silent, too ashamed. A few tried to defend their actions, blaming old customs or their own fear of humans rising too quickly in ranks. One broke down and apologized, voice shaking, eyes lowered. Lyra watched them all, her face calm but her heart heavy. She didn't want to hate them. She only wanted the pain to stop, and for no one else human or not to go through what she had. When they had finished, Vorex called Lyra forward. She walked slowly across the stone floor, under thousands of watching eyes, and stood at the Emperor's side. Do you wish to speak? He asked her quietly. She looked up at him, then at the sky, and then at the crowd. Her voice was soft, but clear. I don't want anyone to fear telling the truth. Even someone like me, small and human, should matter. Her words echoed through the silent court like a soft wind stirring fire. She didn't need to say more. The truth had already spoken through her scars, her silence, and her bravery. Vorex nodded once, then raised his hand. A signal passed through the Imperial Guard. The offenders were led away not with cruelty, but with finality. Their exile would begin at dawn, but their names would be remembered, not as criminals of bloodshed, but as a warning against the slow poison of silent cruelty. Then Vurx turned back to the assembly. "Let this moment be marked in every world under our banners," he said. "Let it be taught in every academy, spoken in every hall, and remembered in every heart. No being, no matter how small, should be crushed by power." The stars seemed brighter then, as if the sky itself approved. The ceremony ended with the tolling of the ancient bell, deep, low, and full of old echoes. The nobles began to disperse, voices hushed, minds changed, but Vurx did not leave. He stood beside Alira, watching the stars, and spoke only to her. "You have reminded us all of something we forgot," he said. "Strength is not in how loud we speak, but in how true we are when we whisper." Alira looked up at him, not afraid this time. She didn't know what her future held, but in that moment, she knew she was no longer invisible, and high above, the stars watched in silence, as they always had. But this time, they watched a girl who had changed the course of an empire with nothing but honesty, quiet courage, and the bruises no one had dared to see until now. Lyra no longer wore the plain gray uniform of a maid. Instead, she now walked through the shining halls of the Imperial Palace in dark blue robes marked with silver threads, the symbol of the Emperor's personal delegate stitched across her shoulder. Though she still felt like the same girl who had once scrubbed floors in silence, trying to avoid notice. The change had happened slowly and yet all at once after the judgment beneath the stars. Whispers of her name now echoed in every corner of the empire, not as a servant, but as the human who stood beside the Dragon Emperor and reminded the galaxy what justice meant. At first, many nobles had been uncomfortable with her presence during council meetings, their expressions stiff, their greetings cold, but the Emperor had made his position clear. Alira was not a guest, not a symbol, but a voice that must be heard. Her role was simple: to observe, to advise, and most importantly, to remind. Vurx wanted her there, not just for show, but because he believed power needed conscience, and for some reason, he believed she had one strong enough to matter. Alira tried to hide her nerves as she entered the grand strategy hall, where generals, in layered armor, and advisors in glowing robes debated the future of worlds. They were discussing the rebellion on the distant mining planet of Orvik 7, where workers, many of them human, had risen up against cruel treatment. Some voices in the room wanted swift military force to crush it. Others wanted silence. Alira sat at the edge, quiet, until Vurx turned to her and asked for her thoughts. The room fell still, all eyes turning toward her, waiting to see if the girl with bruises would speak. Again, her voice shook at first, but she stood. "If we punish them without listening, it will not stop, it will spread," she said. "They rose because no one listened. I know that feeling." Her words were simple, but they struck the air like a spark. One general scoffed quietly, but Vurx silenced him with a glance. "Let her finish," he said. Alira continued, telling them what she had learned about Orvik: how guards beat workers, how rations were stolen, how warnings were ignored. "You can crush their bodies," she said, "but the anger will stay." Vurx nodded slowly, then turned to his commanders. "Send investigators," he ordered. "And send her with them." Gasps filled the room. A human on a diplomatic mission to a rebellion zone. But no one dared argue. When Alira arrived on Orvik 7, the world was dust and stone, the sky red with ash, and the people hollow-eyed. At first, the miners distrusted her, thinking she was another puppet from the palace. But when she walked into their ruined camps without guards, sat with them, listened without judgment, and showed them her own scars, something changed. She spoke with leaders, heard their grief, their rage, and when she returned to Vurx, she brought not just a report, but a proposal for reform, for protection, for better treatment of all species working under the Empire's name. It was bold, and many in power hated it. One noble even accused her of manipulating the Emperor. That night, as she returned to her quarters, she found a message etched into her door. "Know your place." Human, fear crept back into her chest. familiar and cold, but she didn't back down. The next morning, she showed the message to Vurix. He said nothing at first, only stared at the words, then ordered a silent investigation. Days later, 3 high-ranking officials were removed quietly. No trial, no ceremony, just gone. Vurix sent her a message, "You are in your place." From then on, she knew the Emperor would not let her fall again. But danger still lurked in the shadows. Whispers of plots, of those who believed a human did not belong in the halls of power, grew louder. One evening, a cloaked figure tried to intercept her on her way back from a council meeting. The palace guards arrived just in time. The figure vanished, but the warning was clear. Vurix doubled her security, though Alira asked him not to. "If I hide," she said, "they win." Vurix simply replied, "Then let them try." Tensions across the galaxy continued to rise, but so did Alira's influence. People began to send her messages, workers, students, even governors asking for help, advice, fairness. She became a symbol of something strange and new, a human, in power not because of strength or blood, but because she had spoken when it mattered. In time, she began drafting her own ideas for a new policy, one that would protect the weak, limit noble abuses, and make it law that no being, regardless of species, could be struck, shamed, or silenced without consequence. She showed it to Vurix in private. He read every word, then looked at her long and hard. "If we pass this," he said, "the old houses will rise against us." Alira nodded. "Then let them rise. They'll fall just as fast." Vurix grinned. "For the first time in days, you've learned to speak like an emperor." But Alira shook her head. "No," she said. "I speak like someone who remembers what it's like to have no one speak for them." And in the cold heart of the Empire, where dragons ruled and power once crushed the voiceless, a human girl with scars on her skin and fire in her voice became the most dangerous kind of force. Not a warrior, not a queen, but a reminder that truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. The fire started not in the sky, but in the hearts of people who had been silent for too long. Miners, servants, scholars, soldiers, even low-born nobles, those who had watched the human girl rise from a bruised maid to a voice that changed the course of stars, and now they too began to speak, to question, to dream of something greater than fear and chains. And that dream caught flame when Alira's law was officially announced by the Emperor himself. Standing tall beside her as she read its words aloud from the Imperial balcony, her voice clear across the capital, and while some cheered, others clenched their fists in silence, for they saw this moment a threat to their ancient power. And deep within the dark towers of the old houses, the last loyalists of the fallen nobles gathered in secret, planning not rebellion, but destruction. That night, while the people celebrated and candles lit windows across the planet, the Shadow Blades, an outlawed elite unit loyal to the old ways, slipped through the palace shields using stolen access codes, their blades cloaked in phase energy. Their orders simple: eliminate the girl, break the Emperor's will, and restore the old order. And as the silent alarms flared across Vurix's chambers, he knew they were already inside. Alira, still in the council chamber, reviewing letters from outer colonies, didn't hear the first screams, but she felt the vibration in the floor, like thunder rising beneath her feet. And the guards outside the door were already moving too. "Shield her, we must go," one of them said. But Alira stood frozen as the power flickered and the lights died, replaced by red glow, and suddenly the door burst open, not from enemies, but from Commander Varel, eyes blazing, sword drawn. "With me," he barked, and they ran through the smoke-filled halls while sirens howled and walls sealed behind them. All across the palace, fire teams clashed with the invaders, energy bolts lighting up the night. But the Shadow Blades were not ordinary foes. They had trained to kill dragons, to strike before sound, and they moved like ghosts. 2 guards fell before Alira's eyes before they reached the safe chamber, and as the door sealed shut, she felt her hands shaking not from fear, but from something deeper, something rising in her chest like pressure waiting to burst. They came for me, she whispered, and Variel nodded grimly. They won't stop. You've changed too much. She looked at him, then at the wounded soldiers slumped near the wall, and said, Then I need to change more, with the Emperor coordinating defense from the throne room. Alira knew she couldn't hide. She opened the secure lines to the outer sectors, sending a single message to every world under the Empire's banner. They fear us not because we are weak, but because we are changing what power means. I am still standing. Stand with me. That message, simple and raw, spread faster than the fire in the sky, and on dozens of planets, uprisings broke out, not violent ones, but peaceful blockades, marches, messages of unity, humans and non-humans alike raising their voices. In the palace, the fight turned when Verix himself entered the fray, his armor shining, wings unfolding as he crashed into the shadow blades with fury unseen in decades, and beside him shockingly Alira, armored now in ceremonial steel, not to fight but to stand in defiance, to show the people that she would not run. And the final blow came when the people themselves flooded the plaza, demanding an end to the violence, their voices a wave stronger than any weapon. The invaders, seeing they had lost not just the battle, but the will of the people, tried to escape, but were caught. And in the final trial that followed, Alira stood once again in the same place where she had once been questioned, not as a victim, this time, but as a symbol of survival, hope, and change. The Emperor offered her the title of Star Voice, the highest advisor to the throne, but she asked for something else instead. A council of representatives from every species, every planet, every background. Let them have a voice, she said. So it doesn't depend on one person anymore, and Verix agreed, for he saw the future in her eyes. The fire that had once only burned inside her now lit up the whole empire, not as destruction, but as the dawn of something new. Alira walked out to the palace balcony again days later, the scars on her hands visible, the sky behind her filled with ships from every corner of the stars, not for war, but for unity. And as she looked at the people below, she knew the pain had not been in vain. The fire had awakened something they could no longer ignore, a galaxy where even a bruised human maid could change the fate of empires.